What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Now, contrary to what some people may claim, or some people may even believe, I don't necessarily want to believe that Jesus didn't exist in history. I want to believe in the best explanation for historical events in the past and for other historical things. And in general, I want to believe what's true about reality. Given that my allegiance in this particular context is to the truth of reality and not any one particular concept, I'm always looking for reasons why I should change my perspective, why I should move away from one particular position for a better position. That's why anytime I see a video that supposedly claims that there are some few reasons, in this case 3, as to why I should believe that Jesus did exist in history, I'm going to pay attention to it. They may bring up new evidence, or they may bring up evidence in a new context, or make me think about evidence in a different way. And I highly encourage that here on this channel. Always seek out people that are opposed to your position, or that make arguments against whatever position that you hold, because you might be wrong about them and they might have the argument to convince you away from a bad position. Today, though, we're taking a look at a channel called The Epitome. The host of the channel, Nathan, is going to take us through 3 reasons why he thinks that Jesus existed in history, and 3 reasons why we should think that he existed in history. So my ears are completely open and ready to receive these 3 reasons. So if you want to fuck around and find out 3 reasons why you should think that Jesus existed in history, but probably don't actually prove that Jesus existed in history, then please stay tuned.
Hello and welcome to The Epitome. I am your host, Nathan Bozeman, and today we're going to be asking a very important question. Was Jesus a real historical figure? Let's get into it.
Obviously, anybody that has watched my channel for any certain amount of time knows that I don't think that Jesus existed in history. Now, do I think that this is an important question for atheists in general? Not exactly. I mean, I think that you can definitely be justified in not believing in God or Jesus based on the pure fact that a Jew resurrecting from the dead in the 1st century is highly unlikely and most likely didn't happen. So this question is only for those that are really concerned about the truth of history. What actually happened at this point? What can we know that actually happened? And that's where I'm very interested in history. I get it. A lot of you heathens out there are like, well, Jesus may have existed and that's not really all that big of a deal, but that says nothing about whether or not he was magical. And I get having that particular sentiment, but I don't find like the discussion on whether or not Jesus was magical to be all that enlightening. I mean, yeah, magic doesn't exist. What's a harder question for us to ponder? What's a harder thing for us to prove or investigate? And I'm always searching out for these challenges. Like I never want to be complacent and just sitting still in a place. Like I always want to be, in a very challenging space. Like, and the question of whether or not Jesus existed is a very challenging question because we don't have a lot of evidence in the first place. It's hard to determine what actually happened in the past, and the best that we can do is find out what most likely happened. So this is a very challenging question, and I get it if there are people out there that don't like to, challenge themselves in that way, or don't like to pose challenging questions or investigate challenging ideas. I get that, but I'm very interested in challenging myself. So that's why I continue to investigate this kind of question. And I hope that you will join me on this quest to investigate the question whether or not Jesus existed. While I currently hold the position that Jesus probably didn't exist, that's not necessarily going to be my position for the rest of my life, and it's definitely not something that I want to be true. I just so happen to think that it's most likely true. Hopefully the Epitome, or Nathan here, can convince me away from this position. Let's find out.
Mythicism, the belief that Jesus did not exist, is continuously growing in secular circles. And so today what we're going to do is give 3 reasons to believe that Jesus was a real historical person. And my first 2 are going to be biblical arguments, and my last one is going to be an extra biblical argument. And so hopefully we'll cover all the bases today on why you should believe Jesus is a historical figure.
Before we get into his arguments, I know a lot of people cringe at the whole idea of using the Bible to prove that Jesus existed, because that seems circular. In certain respects, it is. But you have to understand that there are different books that comprise the Bible. Now, do I think that the Gospels can prove that Jesus existed? Not exactly. I think that if you use certain portions of the Gospels to prove that Jesus definitely did exist, that's definitely circular, because those are the claims about something that Jesus did or said or something like that. Like, those are the claims of these things. So in order to use those in order to prove that Jesus existed, that ends up being circular. Does that mean that the Gospels don't hold any historical value? That's a little bit harder of a question, because there are people like Dr. Bart Ehrman who thinks that there are historical nuggets within the Gospels that are reported by the Gospels. And he has a number of these particular things, like Jesus' birthplace in Bethlehem and then him moving to Nazareth. He feels like, Dr. Bart Ehrman that is, feels like that is most likely historical, because he can't conceive of any reason why they would invent a convoluted backstory like that. I've explained my ideas behind it in that both of those places, as far as it relating to Jesus or the Messiah goes, are scripturally inspired. That's how I explain it. But, there are scholars out there that are not convinced by that particular argument, and that's perfectly fine. But I just wanted to, head off at the pass this idea that, he's using the Bible to prove that Jesus existed. That's circular logic, because I feel the best evidence for Jesus existing is actually in Paul's epistles, which is part of the Bible. And so that would fall into the whole the Bible proves that the Bible's true kind of thing. And it's not exactly that, because Paul's epistles are different than the Gospels. Paul's epistles are actual letters written by an author that claims to be Paul the Apostle. And there's no reason for us to doubt that somebody named Paul the Apostle, wrote these things and knew certain people in this area. So perfectly fine assuming that Paul, most likely existed, and that he wrote these letters, and that these letters are representative of historical things that happened to him, in that I would interpret some of these things differently than a Christian would, mainly being that I don't think that Paul, got a message from some kind of celestial Jesus. I think that he had hallucinations and all this other stuff. So there's those things, and then there are certain interpretive things like in the Corinthian Creed, where it claims to have 500 witnesses to Jesus resurrecting from the dead, or Jesus appearing to them, or something like that. I don't think that that's an accurate portrayal of history. That's just a claim that's made by Paul, and even he is just repeating a claim from somebody else, so that's not evidence either. So there are a bit nuances in using Paul's work, but I feel like Paul's work is separate from the Gospels. The Gospels are fictionalized, and they are inspired by Scripture, and we don't know if there were any real historical sources behind the Gospels. That's why the Gospels are not historically reliable. So we're about to get into his 3 reasons. Let's see what his first one is.
The first reason to believe that Jesus is a historical figure is the letters of Paul. The reason we can point to Paul's letters as good evidence for Jesus being a historical figure is because people believe that Paul himself is a historical figure.
I think that this is a really bad reason to believe that Jesus existed, because just because Paul existed as a historical person, or at least we're assuming so for the purposes of the mythicism discussion, that doesn't mean anything about Jesus. It literally means nothing about whether or not Jesus existed. And primarily, that's because Paul never relates to us any true historical facts about Jesus. He only talks about Jesus' theology and the visions that he received from Jesus. He never talks to us about any kind of real historical version. Now, some people would disagree with me on this, there's Galatians 1:19 that supposedly claims that Jesus had a brother. Y'all know that I contest that. Then there's Romans 1:3 that talks about Jesus being descended from David in a very real sort of parental sense. Jesus was physically born on earth and everything like that. Then there's Galatians 4:4 that claims that Jesus was born of a woman. So there are certain passages in Paul that at first glance look like they are referencing a historical Jesus, but upon closer inspection, of the original Greek and the surrounding context of those passages, it's actually a lot more vague. So just because Paul existed does not mean that Jesus definitely did. You would have to make an argument about some kind of information in Paul that shows that Jesus existed in history. That's what you would have to do. Not just the automatic assumption, oh, an apostle existed, therefore Jesus had to have existed. There were plenty of fictional people in the past that have had apostles.
Scholars agree that the Apostle Paul was a real historical person. Early independent writers mention Paul, like Peter, Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, and many others. Some of Paul's letters are disputed, but Paul's authorship of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, and Galatians are undisputed by almost all scholars. So, since Galatians is an undisputed text by scholars today, let's see what it has to say about Paul and how he could know that Jesus really existed. In Galatians chapter 1, it says, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, Peter, and stayed with him for 15 days. But I did not see another one of the apostles except for James, the Lord's brother. And Bart Ehrman says if Jesus didn't exist, surely his best friend and his brother would know about it.
Now, I loathe Bart Ehrman on this one particular topic. I feel like most of the other topics that Bart Ehrman covers, he's perfectly fine. Like, he's definitely making coherent arguments for it. But on this particular topic, Bart Ehrman just seems to be woefully wrong on a lot of things. Like, for instance, if you look at what Bart Ehrman said, that Nathan is quoting here, he says that if Jesus didn't exist, his best friend and his brother would have known about it. Well, first off, does Paul say that Peter was Jesus' best friend? In fact, the only thing that we get from Paul is that Peter was an apostle, not that he somehow personally knew Jesus, like while he was alive on earth or anything like that. We don't get any of that from Paul. So we have no idea what kind of relationship Peter had to Jesus, other than Jesus, after his resurrection, celestially appeared to Peter in a vision to him, just like Paul received a vision. Paul describes his visions. They're definitely hallucinations, and they're definitely celestial versions of this Jesus, which can be thought of as having a physical body. Like, this is not some kind of ghosty spiritual kind of thing experience. And when we talk about celestial figures in this particular sense, I believe that, Paul and Peter and the apostle James that gets mentioned in Galatians 2, not the James that's mentioned here, they all received visions from what they considered to be a very physically embodied Jesus. But the important part is that it all happened after Jesus died and resurrected. So this is celestial, like post-resurrection kind of Jesus here. And that really factors into the claims that are made by Paul and by the other apostles. In order to get this whole idea of Peter being Jesus' best friend, you have to actually go to the Gospels. And the relationship between Jesus and his supposed disciples is not exactly a historical fact. Like, we don't actually know what kind of relationship Jesus would have had with his disciples if he was actually here on earth. So there's no way for Bart Ehrman to actually justify Peter being Jesus' best friend other than to take the Gospels at face value in how they report Jesus' interactions with his disciples. Next, the whole brother of the Lord thing I've covered a lot, and I will just sort of refer back to a previous clip where I fully explained the whole brother of the Lord thing, and I'll insert that right here. That the word that Paul uses, adelphos, is actually a very ambiguous word to use if you're wanting to denote a blood kinship. As we did with the previous evidence that they gave, we need to ask, what is the natural meaning of the word for Paul? And not just what we would consider as the natural use in this given context. And we can determine what this natural meaning for Paul would be by how he uses this word in other similar contexts. Like, say, when Paul is talking about brothers and sisters of the Lord, or brothers and sisters in general. 1 Corinthians 9:5 actually uses the exact same word that Paul uses in Galatians 1:19, adelphos. But here, Paul is actually referencing a sister or fellow female Christian. It's either that, or Paul was describing how in early Christianity they heavily engaged in incest. 2 Corinthians 2:13 describes Titus as Paul's brother, but he wasn't literally Paul's brother, he was just a brother of the Lord or a brother in Christ. And, of course, they use the exact same word, adelphos. And you'll notice when you look at all these passages, a trend is occurring. Adelphos is primarily used to denote a fictive kinship, at least with the author Paul. This is because of Romans 6, 3 through 10 and Romans 8, 29. Those two passages establish that Paul considers all baptized Christians to be brothers and sisters of the Lord, or of Jesus. They are considered to be part of God's family and are thus brothers and sisters of Jesus. This fact alone convolutes any familial ties that are referenced by Paul. In this section, Ian also complained about how denoting James as just a general Christian would not actually distinguish him from any apostle that could be referenced here. And I just don't understand why he would think this. The word apostle would be the distinguishing word to denote somebody as not being just a general Christian, but a special type of Christian. While every Christian that had been baptized was considered to be a brother or sister of the Lord, apostles would be a special class of Christian that would need to be separated from the general Christian audience. Because they weren't just baptized a Christian, they had actually personally received a vision of Jesus that denoted them as being an apostle. So it seems to me like Paul is denoting James as just a general Christian here, and there's no real reason to say that this particular phrase would mean that Peter was not also a brother of the Lord. It just means that James was not an apostle. So yeah, the whole Galatians 1, 18 to 19 thing where it talks about this brother of the Lord doesn't necessarily mean a blood relative. It can be a fictive kinship. And so that makes this verse very vague and is not solid proof that Jesus actually existed in history or even had any kind of blood kin. So this point's kind of moot. Like, this piece of evidence from Paul is not convincing.
So to recap, Paul's letters are good evidence for the fact that Jesus really existed because he himself is a historical figure, according to all scholarship, and he says that he met with Peter and James for 15 days and talked about Jesus. Okay?
Well, yes, Paul did meet with them and talk to them, but it doesn't actually tell us that they talked about Jesus or anything about the historical Jesus or anything like that. Paul doesn't relate anything about that. I mean, he just said that he met up with them for this amount of time. Now, later on in Galatians 2, Paul does say that he went up there and he conferred his gospel with the other apostles, and they pretty much had the exact same gospel that he was preaching. And the important thing there is that Paul was completely separate from the people in Jerusalem, like Peter and James and John and all them. He was completely separate from them. Like, he didn't get his gospel from them, but he had the same gospel as them. And I can easily explain that by saying that both Paul and Peter and James and John were all interpreting the Old Testament in the exact same way. So they essentially came from the same sect of Jews, or at least they developed into the same sect of Jews that eventually became Christians, because they were all preaching the exact same gospel. Now, that doesn't mean that Paul and Peter didn't have their own squabbles over different theological points, but as far as the gospel of Jesus and the basic theology of Christianity, they didn't have any kind of differing opinions on that. They all had the same message because it was revealed to them either by Jesus through a vision or by reading the scriptures to reveal hidden information about the Messiah. But the important point here for what he said was that at no place in Paul's letters does he ever say, oh, I met with these people and they told me historical things about Jesus. That is never conveyed by Paul at all. There's, as far as I know, no verse that can be twisted even to suggest this. There are people that make assumptions about what was talked about, but that's not found in evidence. Like, these assumptions are not based in evidence. They're based in just their spurious speculations.
And so this is good evidence to see that Jesus himself actually existed. Paul can also be appealed to because of his drastic life change. You know, he went from martyring Christians and killing them to preaching the gospel and writing the majority of the New Testament. So what was the change all about? Clearly, he had an encounter with the risen Christ.
You know, this doesn't actually convince me, and I feel like it shouldn't convince anybody else. Because just because somebody had some kind of experience and it made them change their lifestyle or change what they believe, doesn't mean that whatever experience they had is true to reality, or that whatever they think is true to reality is actually true to reality. I think with Paul, he had an experience. I believe he was schizotypal, and I think that I can justify that by the fact that he seems to be able to interact normally with with other people and basically live a fairly normal life, but he also has these visions, which is a characteristic of schizotypal personalities. Also, another thing is that these kinds of cult groups, like the cult group that Christianity started out as, schizotypals generally gravitated towards those groups, and we even have evidence in psychological studies now that that's what happens. Schizotypal people gravitate to these religious groups, these cults, because they treat them as being special and they readily accept them and all this other kind of stuff. So there's no reason to think that it wouldn't have been the exact same case back then. So it seems like Paul and Peter and all of these other apostles were just schizotypals that were held in high regard by that community because they were able to receive these visions, quote unquote visions, from Jesus himself. And they were also revealed information from the scriptures. So Paul having a vision and then changing his whole attitude and joining the group that he once persecuted does not have any kind of connection to whether or not the experience that he had was true to reality, even happened in real life. And anything that Paul then chose to believe does not necessarily comport with reality. So I don't see how this can be convincing. Yeah, people change their minds all the time. Big fucking whoop-de-doo.
Our second reason to believe Jesus is a historical figure can be found in the embarrassing details in the Gospels. The Gospels are our primary source on Jesus. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, the Gospels are biased and they're written for religious purposes. Well, hold on, not so fast, because Jesus himself in the Gospels has some things that he does that would be considered embarrassing. And if you were writing a story, or if someone was making up a story about someone trying to portray them to be God in the flesh, do you think that they would include these kinds of details?
Before we get to these details that he's going to be going over, there are a lot of problems with the criterion of embarrassment, which is what he's describing here. Mainly, how do we know what would be embarrassing? I mean, these things might be embarrassing to us. We might think that they could be embarrassing to somebody, but that doesn't necessarily translate to these first century Jewish Christians or first century Jews for that matter. So my first question about this is, how do you know what was embarrassing? We don't know the vast landscape of Jewish sects at this period of time. Like that we know that they were varying. We know that there was a diverse set of them, but we don't know what each sect taught, what each sect would consider embarrassing. And I think that the fact that we have many embarrassing testimonies about Jesus that are readily accepted by some groups in the first and second centuries, I feel like that kind of squashes this whole idea that there's something embarrassing about the basic story of Jesus. I mean, there's this one thing that we don't have anymore. It's not extant to us now, but we find references to it in other collections where people have cited these things. And even Dr. Bart Ehrman, he cites some of these things in one of his books. I'm sure that I'll have a reference to it up here somewhere. But Dr. Bart Ehrman has enlightened us about this thing called the Greater Sayings of Mary, I believe is what it's called. And in that, Jesus, I love telling this story. I mean, it's totally nasty, but I feel like it drives home the point of this whole embarrassment deal. Like, oh, this is so embarrassing. Why would people believe this? They wouldn't say this about Jesus. It's so embarrassing. But listen to this story, and then when he's going through these supposed embarrassing things, I mean, really challenge yourself on, well, is this really all that embarrassing? Because in the Greater Sayings of Mary, what Jesus does is he takes Mary Magdalene up on top of this mountain, right? And then right in front of Mary Magdalene, he pulls out a fully formed woman from his rib, right? And he takes this fully formed newborn woman out of his rib and butt naked lays her down on top of this mountain and then proceeds to fuck her. Okay, nuts inside of her. And then he reaches into this newly formed woman and pulls out his nut and then looks at Mary and eats it and then says something to the effect of, you must do this in order to live, or something like that. Like he eats his own cum out of this newly formed woman that he essentially just raped right there on the mountain. Now, I tell you this not to be like my normal nasty self, as some people would view me, but as we go through the things that he's about to say are embarrassing to these first century Jews, this was something that was believed by some people. Like, this was a story that was told in some Christian communities. So really kind of take that into consideration when he's going through the list.
Jesus got baptized, which is something that believers today do, humans. Jesus washed the disciples' feet, which was considered a lowly task. Jesus was crucified, which was one of the most shameful ways to be put to death. And finally, Jesus' disciples abandoned him before and after the crucifixion until they witnessed the resurrection.
Oh no! Jesus washed somebody's feet. Oh no! Jesus took a bath in the Jordan. Oh no! His disciples abandoned him. All of this is so much more embarrassing than raping a woman and then pulling your cum out of her and eating it right in front of another woman. This is so much more embarrassing than that. So, jokes aside, like, I feel like all of these things in context, right, of what some of these Jewish Christian sects were teaching about the Messiah in the 1st and 2nd centuries, like what some of them believed about Jesus, I feel like these pale in comparison to them, for one. For two, I can perfectly explain why all of these things were not embarrassing to the early Jewish Christians, or even Jews for that matter. First of all, Jesus being baptized. The original gospel, Mark, actually is an adoptionist gospel where it has the Messiah existing as this incorporeal type of spirit up there with God. And when the figure Jesus, the human figure Jesus, is baptized in the Jordan by John the Baptist, the Messiah figure, this incorporeal being, actually descends upon this human being and inhabits their body and sort of, wears it around like a ghost, like a skinwalker that inhabits a body or something like that, right? So that's in Mark's gospel, and this is an actual academic position that you can look up academic articles about how the gospel of Mark is an adoptionist gospel, and it has the Messiah descending upon this Jesus figure and inhabiting him as soon as he's pulled out of the water by John the Baptist. So Jesus being baptized is something embarrassing. It kind of seems like the initial Christians after Paul, but before the Gospel of Mark, considered this to be needed because the Messiah figure, this pre-existent figure in Judaism, needed to inhabit a physical body on earth. That's how they explained it. So it kind of seems necessary at that point. Not embarrassing, but necessary. Next, Jesus washing the disciples' feet. There's this very prominent theme in the Gospels of the least shall be first. So if Jesus does anything that seems lowly or that seems beneath him, that's actually a theological statement. He's saying that with him being, the Son of God and everything like that, and him doing something lowly, that communicates theologically this whole idea that the least of us shall be the first in heaven. And then Jesus being crucified. I feel like it's been very prominently shown on this channel recently, but also in the scholarship, that even the Jews considered their Messiah to suffer and die a shameful death.
Even though what happened to him is not what was supposed to happen to the Messiah, just the opposite of what was supposed to happen to the Messiah. He got tortured to death by his enemies, which is just the opposite of what's happening. So what they have to do is they have to find places in Scripture that seem to show that someone like Jesus is a plausible Messiah. And so they start finding places, and some of them work better than others.
This was a very awkward thing for me to hear. Don't get me wrong. It's totally on par with what Dr. Ehrman thinks are facts about the historical Jesus. But it is a little confusing considering some information that's recently come to light. Dr. Jason Staples was a student of Dr. Bart Ehrman's when he was doing his dissertation. In Dr. Staples' dissertation, he has a footnote about a pre-Christian idea of a suffering and dying Messiah.
The oft-repeated dictum that there is no evidence for the concept of a suffering and dying anointed one, or of a messianic interpretation of the suffering servant in pre-Christian Judaism, is therefore mistaken. Jason A. Staples, The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, page 180, Cambridge University Press.
As evidence of this fact, Dr. Staples cites William Brownlee's The Servant of the Lord in the Qumran Scrolls, number 1, Louis Ginsburg's The Oldest Interpretation of the Suffering Servant, John Goldingay's Commentary on Daniel, and Portier Young's Apocalypse Against Empire. Ehrman had to review this dissertation and had no problem with Staples having this in his footnote. Compounding on this section in Staples' dissertation, we have the Wisdom of Solomon and the Talmud. The Wisdom of Solomon is a first century Jewish text that the Christians heavily relied upon. In Wisdom 2:20, it says this about the Messiah.
Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for, according to what he says, he will be protected.
The entire section of the Wisdom of Solomon 2:12 to 3:3 attests to this pre-Christian idea of a suffering and dying Messiah. In the Talmud B, Sanhedrin 98b and 93b, it connects the suffering servant in Isaiah 52 and 53 to the Messiah. Then in B Sukkah 52a through b, the Talmud has a Christ ben Joseph that dies and then resurrects, even attaching it to an idea in Zechariah 12:10 that mentions piercing the firstborn son of God to death. Both the Talmud and the Wisdom of Solomon show that if Jews were really adverse to this idea of a disgraced and dying Messiah, then they wouldn't have separately developed the same ideas as Christians did without first explaining why Jesus didn't fulfill these expectations. So it's very obvious that these ideas were already constructed prior to the development of Christianity. So it seems to me that the more scholarly and more accurate description of the Jews in the first century would be that they had a very diverse landscape of ideas in Judaism. Some Jews did expect a triumphant Messiah figure to conquer Jerusalem for the Israelite people. Then there were also some Jews that were expecting a disgraced and dying Messiah. And some of those Jews ended up developing Christianity into a Hellenistic mystery cult, while the others continued in their sect of Judaism, waiting for their disgraced and dying Messiah, this Christ ben Joseph. This is something that was known in Judaism as a potential path for the Messiah. Now, that doesn't mean that that was the only path. Obviously, there were some Jews that considered Jesus or the Messiah to be a military victor, like have a military victory, not a shameful death. But as I said before, the views of Jews in the first century BCE and the first century CE were very diverse. And so they didn't follow one particular paradigm. They had multiple different paradigms, and they had multiple different ideas about what this Messiah figure was supposed to do. One of those is a shameful death. So obviously, this is not something that would be considered embarrassing. Also, another good point to this is that if it was considered embarrassing to these Jews, why did it later show up in the Talmud? And if you remember, the Talmud is commentary from rabbis from the 200 CE to like 500 CE or so on. And those rabbis were commenting on Midrash from 20 BCE on up to 200 CE. I mean, this is a pretty deep-seated Jewish idea that the Messiah is supposed to suffer. So this is also not embarrassing. It's perfectly in line with Jewish expectations. And then finally, Jesus' disciples abandoning him. This is yet another theological point to make, that the Jewish people abandoned, God. Jewish people in the Old Testament always abandoned God, and they were always punished for it later. And so that is a theological point that is being made by Jesus' disciples abandoning him, because the disciples are a representation of the Jewish people. And of course, they stopped abandoning Jesus or God after the resurrection came, thus another theological point. So as you can tell, all these things have perfectly rational and reasonable explanations for why they wouldn't be embarrassing. And that's why I started off with, what was really embarrassing to these people? And I feel like that's the question you have to ask.
If you were going to make up a story where you were portraying a man to be God in the flesh, would you have him be baptized, kind of insinuating that something's wrong with him or he needs to be cleansed?
Well, that wasn't the original insinuation that there was something wrong with him or anything like that. It was for adoptionist purposes. So, and the fact that the first gospel, Mark, is the one that said, oh, he was baptized by John the Baptist, and then later on, all the other gospels just copied off of that one. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable explanation for that.
Or would you have him be crucified, which is one of the most shameful ways to be killed?
If crucifixion was one of the most shameful ways to be killed, that's exactly how I would expect the Messiah, who's supposed to suffer a shameful death, to be killed. Yeah.
Or would you have his followers abandon him and be cowards and leave and then only come back and proclaim the gospel after they experience the resurrection?
I mean, you mean like the Jews had always done to God? They believe in him and then they don't believe in him. They abandoned God. And then after some miraculous things happen that show that God is still with them, they come back and they believe in God only to abandon God once again until some miraculous shit happens. And this is just the terminating end to it. Like, this is the final thing that's supposed to bring everybody back to God. Yeah, I totally fucking expect that.
Or would you have him do lowly tasks like washing people's feet?
I mean, if the least are to be first, and, you know, Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection, then yes, the least, Jesus doing what the least would do, and then him being first to resurrect, it seems perfectly in line with that particular theme. So yeah.
This doesn't seem to me like they're fabricating some narrative, but it sounds like they're giving authentic testimony about what really happened.
I mean, it totally sounds like they're just making bullshit up that sounds right and that works with the themes that they're trying to communicate to Christians and Gentiles. So yeah, I mean, it sounds perfectly in line with what they would want to teach.
And our third and final reason for today to believe that Jesus is historical is external or contemporary corroboration. I'm going to share quotes from two different historians writing within the first and early second century. The first one's going to be Josephus, and I have to give one preliminary remark before I get into it. The first quote I'm going to share with you is undisputed by scholars. It's considered authentic, and that there was nothing different about it when he wrote it himself. The second quote, there's a lot of controversy around it because it seems to have been doctored by a later scribe who was a Christian. And so a lot of people throw this quote out and say that it's not authentic. But I've actually taken out all the parts that scholars think are doctored. And so hopefully what I have left to read to you is the authentic quote from Josephus himself. But if you're not okay with that, take the first quote for what it says, and then you can take the second one with a grain of salt.
So I feel like most people would know what two passages in Josephus that he's talking about. And so the first one he's talking about with the James reference, that's Antiquities 2200. And I actually have prepared like clips for not only this particular reference, the James reference, but also the reference in like the Testimonium Flavianum that everybody knows. So I'm actually just going to put those two clips right here right now because I don't feel like reiterating the exact same argument against them. But just know that, this is pretty well known. The James reference doesn't actually prove that this James is the same James in the Gospels was the James that was the Lord's brother or whatnot. And then, of course, the Testimonium Flavianum, I believe, is wholly inserted. But I'll let Past John actually elucidate these things right now. So enjoy. They went for the James reference, which is the lesser referenced citation of Jesus in Flavius's work. But the problem with using that is that it was most likely interpolated, because in that passage later on, they reference a completely different Jesus ben Damnius, as if they had been talking about that guy the entire time. So it makes more sense that the earlier part, the who was called Christ, was inserted in order to create a reference to Jesus. And the reason why this is the most likely conclusion about this particular reference is that Josephus doesn't bother to explain what a Christ is at that point. Now, if the Testimonium Flavianum had existed in Josephus's work, like a lot of people want to say, then at that point, Josephus, like he's done for several other groups and several other people in the rest of his work, would have referenced back to that particular passage to explain what a Christ was to his audience, or to remind them rather what a Christ was. But he doesn't do that. So you can't use that particular explanation. The other thing is that Josephus does not explain what a Christ is within that particular paragraph. If this concept of a Christ and what it means to the Jews had not been discussed previously, then Josephus would feel compelled to explain it at that point. But he doesn't do that. And the fact that he doesn't do that is quite odd for Josephus because, like I said before, he does this for every other group that he brings up and mentions to his audience. So it just simply doesn't make sense that this who would be called Christ would be put there. It most likely originally said something about this James being the brother of Jesus ben Damnius. I don't know what form that would have taken, but it would make a lot more sense if Jesus ben Damnius was being referenced and not Jesus who was called Christ. And now here's a refutation of the Testimonium Flavianum. I do want to present the most defensible position against the authenticity of the Testimonium Flavianum. As we've already shown with Alice Wheatley's work, who conclusively proved that all existing versions of the Testimonium Flavianum, including the Arabic and Syriac versions, all ultimately stem from Eusebius in the 4th century. Between 220 CE and 320 CE, the Testimonium Flavianum seems to just pop into existence out of nowhere, almost like somebody just inserted this passage into Josephus's work. This already makes it highly unlikely that Josephus would have written it. You can also look at Paul Hopper's work in A Narrative Anomaly in Josephus, where he establishes 1. The Testimonium Flavianum uses finite verbs in a very different way than Josephus does elsewhere in his writing. 2. The Testimonium Flavianum uses oblique and passive language to insert Pilate into this passage, which is completely contradictory to how Josephus inserts Pilate into his work in the surrounding passages. 3. The Testimonium Flavianum has a completely different time organization than all of the surrounding passages. 4. The Testimonium Flavianum seems to be absent of a plot, which is completely contradictory to all of the passages surrounding this passage. And finally, 5, the Testimonium Flavianum would only make sense to Christians. G.J. Goldberg has established a link between the Testimonium and the Emmaus Road story in Luke's Gospel. There are 19 parallels in both of these works. It's not just the fact that the parallels exist, it's the fact that these parallels exist in the exact same order in both works. This makes coincidence highly unlikely and dependence highly likely. Ken Olson has also established multiple parallels in both language and content between Eusebius and the Testimonium Flavianum. This coincides with the fact that the Testimonium seems to pop into existence right around the time Eusebius was the caretaker of the library that Josephus's work was contained in. Louis Feldman has also come to the conclusion that a Christian like Eusebius most likely wrote the Testimonium Flavianum. Phrases such as wise man, worker of amazing deeds, teacher of human beings, and Christian tribe are used by Eusebius to describe both Jesus and Christians, but are otherwise unused in the rest of Josephus's work outside of the Testimonium. Additionally, the Testimonium fails to even describe what it means to be a Christian, which is very uncharacteristic of Josephus, considering that he does it for all of the other sects he mentions. One common way that you can test for an interpolation is to take the passage or phrase out of the context in which it appears. If the surrounding text seems to flow seamlessly together, then it may have been interpolated. This is exactly the case for the Testimonium, because the paragraph prior to this flows seamlessly into the paragraph after it with the Testimonium removed. Finally, as stated before, the Testimonium Flavianum seems to pop into existence between the 3rd and 4th centuries. Origen had ample reason to quote this passage from Josephus because Origen regularly quotes Josephus. In fact, no other pagan or Christian scholar mentions this passage prior to Eusebius in the 4th century. Normally, just because somebody doesn't talk about it doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't there, unless other people had ample reason to talk about it. In the case of the Testimonium Flavianum, we definitely have ample reason for other people to quote it if it existed prior to the 4th century. This mountain of evidence leads us to the conclusion that either Eusebius or his predecessor Pamphilus inserted the Testimonium Flavianum into Josephus's work using Luke's Gospel and the Emmaus Road story in order to generate the skeletal structure for the testimonial.
So these quotes are from a 1st century historian named Josephus, because he was born around 37 AD and died around 100 AD. He calls James the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, and we learn as well that he was killed under Pontius Pilate. And you might say, well, that's in the second quote, that's debated. Well,
so obviously, I disagree with his conclusion here that Josephus proves that Jesus existed in history. And as we saw with my refutations of it, nobody should be convinced by Josephus. And I feel like there's reasonable pushback against the James passage. There are some people that think that it's, unimpeachable. Like you can't argue, like it makes no sense to argue against that particular one. But I feel like the counter argument to it is quite convincing. And so for me, that means that we can't tell whether or not this actually is a reference to Jesus. But there's a lot of things that don't make sense if it were a reference to Jesus. So I don't know. I feel like you have to throw out Josephus entirely as evidence. And I feel like a majority of scholars are beginning to gravitate towards that position. And by scholars in this particular respect, I'm talking about New Testament scholars. They're starting to see the problems with referencing Josephus. And so a lot of them are starting to move away from that. I'm not going to say like nobody uses it, but I mean, I feel like if you're going to be arguing about this particular topic, I do think that scholars need to start shucking Josephus because it's just not a good reference to Jesus. But he is about to get into Tacitus. Woo woo!
We're going to get into our quote from Cornelius Tacitus now, and we'll see that this is actually established historical fact outside of the Bible and a non-contested quote.
He reads Tacitus's quote. I have a lot of problems with it. Now, there are good responses to the Tacitus quote as not being written by Tacitus. Like there's a certain section of it, particularly the part that mentions Pilate and Jesus being crucified and all that. One important aspect of it to note is that originally written was not Christ, but Christus. Not referencing my app or anything. If y'all know what my app is, it's called Christus. But in this particular respect, Christus is an actual name. It's a name that was regularly used at the time, and so it actually meshes well with Tacitus referencing Christus here to something that Suetonius said about this Christus, stirring up the Jews and causing a lot of problems. But a lot of people want to try to counter that with this idea that, that was just a common misspelling. They were being very shitty towards the Christians, and so this was just another way to insult them. And I mean, I would need you to actually cite that, like cite where it shows that Suetonius, either Suetonius or Tacitus were, didn't know how to reference Christians properly, or, thought that the Christians were actually Christians or something of that nature. You would need to cite some kind of evidence for that, and I just don't think that you have that kind of evidence. But also the misspelling kind of counter argument, like this was a common misspelling of Christians. Now that works for vulgar writers in Greek. Now, vulgar doesn't mean that they say like curse words or anything at the time. Vulgar just means that they were very, very simple, like not very well experienced in writing. And to say that of Tacitus, I feel like is really unreasonable because Tacitus was not some kind of vulgar writer. He, was a very literate and elite writer in Greek. So I feel like that counter argument kind of falls by the wayside. So Tacitus, in my opinion, I follow along with Robert Van Voorst, who did an analysis on Tacitus, and he agrees with R.T. France about this particular passage not being a reference to a historical Jesus because there's no way to actually establish that this is independent information from the Gospels. There's no way to establish that Tacitus was using some other kind of source. We don't know what source that Tacitus was using, and since it aligns so well with the Gospels, it either came directly from the Gospels or from Christians themselves. And so we can't actually use this as proof that Jesus exists. I don't know if those are his only two external corroborating references, but if those are not good.
He did not seem to like Christians very much, did he? That's actually why this is such an important source, because it's written so close to Christ, whether it's the late 1st or early 2nd century. And on top of that, he calls Christians a disease, and he says that it originated from a man named Christus, Jesus, who was killed under Pontius Pilate.
There's a very interesting thing that Nathan did here, and that's that he equates the name Jesus with Christos. Christos is a title. It just means the anointed one. And there were many Christos in Judaism. There were many anointed ones. I mean, King David was an anointed one in Judaism. So equating Christos to Jesus, I feel, is unsupported. Like, we don't know that Tacitus used Christos to refer to Jesus. Just he was referring to technically Christus is what Tacitus, as far as we can tell, originally wrote. Of course, we don't have the original writing of Tacitus. We have later copies of it, so it could just be a copy error, of course. But as it originally existed in the extant copies that we have, it was actually Christus. But even if you take it as Christos, saying that means Jesus is just unfounded, for one. For two, true, this was written fairly close, but the time period that this references is 64 CE, and we already accept that there were Christians in 64 CE, so the portion that is claimed to have been inserted later or fabricated, like Dr. Richard Carrier claims that particular section was actually inserted later. And he makes a really good argument for that. But I feel like in order to disregard Tacitus as a reference to a historical Jesus, we don't even need to go that far, because that particular passage right there that refers to those very gospel type things, that only relates the beliefs of Christians at the time, which would fall in line with Tacitus having his pen pal Pliny the Younger tell him about what Christians believed, or Tacitus getting this kind of information from Christians directly. So this doesn't actually prove anything about a historical Jesus. It does prove something about Christians in that they were in Rome in 64 CE, and it relays what these Christians believe. Given that 64 CE was about the time when, Jesus was getting euhemerized into history, but also Tacitus was writing in the 2nd century, it doesn't necessarily mean that those were the beliefs of the Jewish Christians in the 1st century. That just means that these were the beliefs of the Jewish Christians in the 2nd century. Well, by that time they had just become Christians, really. So, I mean, this doesn't actually prove anything.
And we also see in this quote that Christians were being persecuted within the 1st and 2nd century. So this is also something historical that can point to the fact that people like Paul and Peter would have been martyred because of the persecution. So there you have it. Those are our 3 reasons to believe that Jesus was a real historical person.
Oh, well, shit. I guess there's no real reason for me to change my position then, because all of those things are not convincing whatsoever. So, I guess good for this guy, Nathan, to put this up and try his hand at proving that Jesus existed. But I just feel all of the reasons that he listed are not sufficient enough for me to stop believing that Jesus was a purely mythical figure. I would really love to know what all of you heathens think down below. Do you think that Nathan's 3 reasons are sufficient enough to believe that Jesus existed in history, or do you think that maybe we need stronger reasons? Let me know down below in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.